So before we get started, can I just get a show of hands for how many people here work with workflows on a daily basis? So most of you, and that's probably why you're here. So, by our definition, the workflow is just the management of a sequence of steps in a business process, and that can be anything from a vacation request approval to a document approval to an expenses report. And so workflows really are, relevant to everybody. And again, by a show of hands, how many people here are familiar with Google Sites? So most of you as well. And how many of you were at the AppScript talk yesterday? OK, so about half of you. So great. Just for those that aren't familiar, Google Sites is just an easy way to create and share web pages and websites. You can embed documents. You can share them with your coworkers. And you can even publish them on the web. AppScript is our cloud scripting service. It's a server-side JavaScript language, and you can use it to extend and automate Google Apps. So here's the agenda for today. I'm going to go over the basics of scripts and sites. Then I'll talk about a simple workflow, which is posting comments to a site owner. Then I'm going to go over a slightly more complex document approval workflow. And then Evan's going to talk to you about advanced document approval. So let's go ahead and start with script and sites. So if you're familiar with app scripts, you know that they are available in spreadsheets, and you can use them to interact with all sorts of Google apps. But ultimately, I think sites really serve as the hub for workflows. If you think of your HR site or your team site or your expenses application, these are all sites in which these workflows live. And so we're happy to say that since the beginning of this year, Google Apps Script is available in Google Sites. With it, you can now write scripts that interact with a site directly, and you can create these script gadgets that let you render dynamic content on a site's page. If you use sites, it's actually really easy. You can use scripts to create pages, to share the site to other people, to apply themes and templates, to search. Pretty much anything you can do through the site's UI, you can do with app scripts. So now there's this top-level sites app class. With it, you can grab a site object by domain name and site name. Once you have a site object, you can interact with the 4 basic page types, which are web page, list page, announcement page, and file cabinet page. Themes can be applied to pages or templates. And pages are mostly standard HTML, so they're really easy to create and edit with app scripts. You can also share at the site level very easily. You can add and get each of the roles, the user roles, so there's viewer, collaborator, and owner. When you add somebody, you add them by email address, and when you get the users for a role, you get an array of email addresses. So really simple. How do you use it? In the insert menu, you can see here, there's a new AppScript gadget menu item. And that's available in the page edit mode. That lets you insert these script gadgets that dynamically render content. They work just like any other sites gadget. A lot of the properties are the same, and there's some additional things that let you change the behavior of script gadgets. In addition, in the Manage Site pages, there's a new AppScript tab that lets you see the scripts that you have in the site. And you can launch the editor, which you're probably already familiar with if you want to write new scripts. So let's go ahead and talk about a simple workflow. So one thing that's been requested in sites that still isn't available is the ability to email a site owner without revealing their email address. And it turns out this is actually really easy to do with app scripts. There's 2 parts to this problem. The first part is the rendering of this form. You can see what that might look like on this screenshot. And the second part is to actually grab the owners and send them an email. This is the code to do that second part, which I would say is the most important part. And it's really only 2 lines long. This is the send email function. That underscore means it's a hidden function. We're not going to go into that here. It's not really relevant. But in the first line of the function, we use sitesapp.getSite. We grab our site by domain and name. We call getOwners on that site object, which gives us an array. And then in the second line, we join that array into a comma-separated string. We pass it to mailapp.sendEmail. We'll set the subject line to hello and the body of the email to e.parameter.email. And I'll show you where that comes from later on. But that's pretty much it. That will send an email to the site owners. So let's talk about where we actually get that email from. And this is the code to render that form. We use the built-in doGet function in AppScript, and that means that we're going to be publishing this script as a service, which lets us render content in the script gadget. In the first few lines, we will use UI app, and I hope at least some of you guys are familiar with this. UI app.createApplication will create a UI application, obviously, that will let you render content. We'll set its title to contact owners. We'll create a vertical panel that lets you arrange things vertically on the screen. Set its ID to main panel, which lets us refer to it later on. Set its spacing, and obviously you can make it arbitrarily beautiful, but we're going to keep things simple here. Then we're going to add it to the app, so pretty basic. Then we're going to call session.getActiveUser. That gets the user that's currently viewing the form. We get their email address, and we will add a label to show who the email is coming from as the first element in the main panel. Then we will create a text area, set its height and width, and set its name to email. And this is where that e.parameter.email came from. Finally, we're going to create a submit button. We'll create a server click handler that points to that send email function I just showed you. We will add the main panel as a callback element, and that lets us get the content of the main panel in our handler. We'll add the handler to the submit button, add the submit button to the main panel, and we'll return the app to render it. And that's pretty much it. And for those of you that were at yesterday's talk, you'll know that we now have this AppScript GUI builder, and that's also usable here. But we wanted to keep the code simple and make sure people knew where things were coming from, so we went with code here. So let's see that in action. This is our Acme Corp website. We're going to create a new Contact Us page so that people can go there to send us email. And this is just standard Sites UI that you're probably familiar with. So this is our Contact Us page. It'll drop us in the edit view. We don't have our gadget yet, so we'll just save it. Now, if we go to More Actions, Manage Site, which is at the bottom, we can see that in our admin pages, there's now this AppScript item. Going there shows us the scripts that are already there. We'll launch the editor and paste in the code I just showed you. And I think that all looks right, so we're going to save it, and we will call it Contact Owners. So, OK, so that's it. So let's go back to the site. And on this admin page, if we refresh it, you can see that the Contact Owners is now available. So going back to our Contact Us page, we can now edit that page and add that gadget we just created. From the Insert menu, we'll go to AppScript Gadget, and you see that Contact Owners is now available. We'll select that, and we get a Properties dialog. Now, this is actually important. Because we want to allow anybody who views the site to be able to send email, we're going to allow anyone to invoke this service. And you could have just the members of your domain or even just yourself. At the bottom, those are the standard sites gadget properties. We'll set it to Contact Us and save it. Once we save it, you'll see that our form now renders. So it looks pretty good. The email's coming from Evin at Breakapps. Let's go ahead and type a short message to see if this works. So we're typing. So it looks like, I don't know if you guys were paying attention, but the front page was actually all in Latin. So we don't know how to read Latin. We're going to ask for some help. So let's go ahead and click Submit. And we click it a few times. Nothing seems to really happen. However, if we go to the mail, we see that we actually did get email, and we got it multiple times. So it's sort of working. So what happened there? The problem is that we didn't give the user any feedback. And obviously, we need to tell them that we actually sent the email so that they know not to constantly click that button. Here's that send email function I just showed you. The first two lines are the same. But now we have this extra code that will update the UI. We call UI_app.getActiveApplication. We get the main panel by ID. That's why we set it earlier. We'll set it to not visible so that the user can no longer click on that button. And then we'll add another label that says, thanks for your feedback. Once we add that to the app, we can return it to render it. And let's give it a shot. So we'll go back to our Contact Us page. We type the same message because we still can't read Latin, and the site is still in Latin. So this time when we click Submit, we say thank you for your feedback. All right, so that was pretty easy. I think it's fairly basic. The people who are familiar with AppScript, should be pretty familiar. So let's talk about complex document approvals. Now, document approvals can get really, really complicated. And we're going to start with a simple example and move on from there. So in our simple document approval workflow, there's essentially 3 steps. In the first step, the requester will submit a doc for publication. In the second step, the approver will review and hopefully approve the document. And once the document is approved, we can then publish that. And this is actually really easy to build on top of contact owners. This is the form that we just created. We're going to change the title to Write an Article, change the button to Submit for Publication, and the text area will just be for the document itself. So here's what that's going to look like. We've made the text area a little bit bigger so you can actually see what you're typing. And when you click Submit for Publication, that's just going to send an email to the approver. But what does this mean? Well, it means that documents now live in emails. And as we all know, emails get deleted, they get overlooked, they get forgotten. It's just not a very good situation to be in. So what we really need is to push this data to a data store. For simplicity, we're going to use a spreadsheet in this example. AppScript also supports JDBC connections, so you can push this data to a real database if you like. We're not going to get into this here. The documentation for that is all online, so you can review it if you're interested in that. So here's the approval flow that I've shown you so far. In the first step, the user goes to the site, either types or pastes their document into the form that we created. When they submit that document, it will send an email to the approver, and it will also send that document to our spreadsheet. From the spreadsheet, we can then publish that document either back to the same site or to a new site. So here's a spreadsheet that we think has the columns that are going to be relevant. You can see that we have a column for who the document's from, when it was submitted, when it should be published, the title, the approver, the status, and the content of the document itself. So how do we update that? So again, this is the send email function. The first 2 lines are still the same, but this time we're also going to post that data to a spreadsheet. In the first line, we will say spreadsheet app.openById, and that ID is that funky string of characters that you see in the spreadsheet URL. We'll get the active sheet because there's only one sheet in the workbook. We will call sheet.getRange, and we want to get the first empty row in the sheet. So to do that, we call sheet.getLastRow, which gets the last filled row, and we add 1 to it. Once we have the range, we can set the values that we're interested in, which is the user's email, the date, the fact that it's not been approved yet, and the body of the email, which is the content of the document. So let's see that in action. We've added this getPublished page, where we've already added our gadget. We're going to start typing our document. And in the interest of keeping people awake, we're going to actually paste that document in. From there, we can actually just go down to the bottom and submit it for publication. So this time, we actually get feedback, so that's good. And if we go to our approvals spreadsheet, we see that our document is now here. Its status is unapproved, and the content is in that column. So great. That looks good. Now, from that spreadsheet, how do we publish that back out to a site? This is our publish row function. So it takes 1 parameter. The R variable is going to be the index of the row that you want published. So in the first line, again, we get the sheet by ID. We will grab the range, and that's the range that we're interested in. We call getValues to get the values of that range as a 2-dimensional array. And then we get the site that we want to publish to, sitesapp.getSite, domain, and name. Once we have the site object, we can call createWebPage with the title and the body values from the array. And that will actually go ahead and create a web page directly. If we wanted, we could use an announcements page or an announcements post here. We're going to keep things simple and create just a web page. From there, we're actually done. We've already published the the document. But we want to do a few cleanup tasks. So we will send an email to the author saying, your post is live, here's the URL, and we can update the sheet's status column to be published. So let's try that out. We're going to set a title here because we didn't do that earlier. And this time, we'll go to the site, and we don't have a gadget this time, so we're just going to test that function from the editor directly. We're going to go to app script, and you see that we have our publishing workflow script. This is the publish row function I just showed you, and there's this test function here that calls publish row just on row 2 of the spreadsheet. When we run that, it looks like there were no errors. Something red would have popped up if there were. And if we go back to our site, you see that there's now a lorem ipsum page in the site. So that has all the content that we're interested in. If we go to our email, we see that we got the article published email. Clicking on the link will obviously bring us back to that page. OK, so that was pretty cool. So the user went to the site, submitted their document for publication. We sent an email to the approver. We saved it in the spreadsheet. And from the spreadsheet, we've published it to the site. Now, for those of you that are paying attention, you might have noticed that we're missing a kind of critical part of this workflow, right? In all the approval flows that I've worked with, there's usually an actual approval step. The problem is that there's a whole lot of ways to do approvals. And so I'm going to hand it over now to Evin to talk to you about all the different ways you can complete this workflow.
Thanks, Eric. So as Eric said, we're going to focus a little bit on the approval step, and there's quite a few different ways that we can do this. The document is now safely into our spreadsheet, so we're not too worried about the email. The approver knows about the email and can head back to the control panel. So let's look at using that spreadsheet as a control panel for this whole publishing process. We can write a simple publish function that will simply get the active row of the spreadsheet, the row that the publisher is looking at, and then invoke Eric's publish row function. What we really want, though, is not to have to run that from the script editor, but perhaps to be able to run it from a spreadsheet menu or something convenient. So we can add an onOpen function, and this, like doGet, is another one of those special functions inside AppScript that has a special meaning. And anytime a spreadsheet document is opened, we automatically run this function. So in here, we're just going to add a little bit of code that adds an approval menu onto our control sheet. So let's see that in action. We've got a second article in here about Gravity Probe B. We can go to our script editor inside the spreadsheet this time and paste in all the code we've shown you, including Eric's publish row function. We'll save that. And now what we're going to do is reload the spreadsheet to simulate an onOpen event happening. And you'll see that a new menu pops up, a publish menu. So we'll select a row, and we'll click Approve. You'll see the script is running in the background, and the status updated to published. And now when we go back to our sites page and refresh that, you'll see now we have a new article listed in the left-hand panel. Okay. And obviously, it's the same publish row function that Eric showed us, so that the author will get an email telling them that their article went out. So it's all well and good. Going to a spreadsheet every time you need to approve something is a little bit cumbersome. So let's talk about approving from email, which is maybe a little bit nicer, a little bit slicker. It's far more efficient for the approver. And what we're going to do is send a message with an embedded HTML form. The process just becomes a one-click. So we're going to have a little digression here and talk a bit about HTML forms. How many folks are really comfortable and familiar with HTML forms? OK, so maybe only 50%, so this is probably a good digression. Anytime you log into a website, chances are you're using an HTML form. You put in your username and your password, and you hit a submit button. And here's the actual HTML code that you'd use to do that. You see the first line defines it as a form with a particular action. I've truncated the URL there. And the details from the form are going to be posted back, so it's a post method. We ask for the username, and then we have this input type field. And the first one is a text field called username. And then the second one is a password field, which means that we don't display the content, and it's called password. And then the third input type is actually a submit, and that's the action. And in this case, it's called submit too. So we can mimic this inside script. We're going to write a little test function called send email, and we're going to set a variable called HTML to be a form. Then we're going to send that variable as a payload in an email and basically see what happens. Okay, so that's my little form. It asks a question. What is the name of the Lone Ranger's horse? It gives me an input box to fill in the answer, and it takes a submit button to do an action. So next we want to figure out how we capture that action. So if we look back at the original example of the login page, you'll see that first line is the critical line. It's going to tell the email client, in fact, what to do with the content that's entered in the form once the submit action is chosen. And so we're going to have to publish something at a URL to receive that feedback. So we've talked about onOpen, and we've talked about doGet, and now we're going to talk about doPost. It's another magic function, and when we have a post back to AppScript, it's going to ask this function to handle the payload, which is E, the event. So you can see in my example here, I'm going to create a little UI application. I'm going to add a panel, and into that panel, I'm going to put a label for every parameter that was passed to me. Okay? So I don't know what's going to come in the post. Anybody can post anything to this handler. So let's see where we go with this. Eric showed you earlier how to publish into a site. This is very similar. You can publish as a service, and then you get back a URL to use. So let's watch that in action. I've added my doPost code into my script. You can see it all there. I'm going to go to Share and Publish as Service. And I get the same three familiar options. Allow only me, only members of my domain or organization, or anybody at all to invoke the service. And that's the critical URL. That's now live on the web. And what I want to do is go back to my email payload and use that action in the payload so that the email client knows where to send the click. So a little bit convoluted, but I hope everybody's following along. Now when I send it, my email comes down to the email client. I get the question, I fill in the answer, and this time when I hit submit, we actually are going to post all the content of the form back to our script. Our script is going to handle the payload and print it out on the screen with the little UI app. Very, very basic. It's going to give us the service that's been invoked, which is actually the ID of the URL, and it gives me back the answer. And that's the really important part. So that field that I named answer that was a text box is now coming back to my server, back to my script. So to approve from an email, we're going to use that HTML form capability. We're going to embed the article and the approval button into the email. That's actually not sufficient. We also need a hidden field that tells us which row of the spreadsheet we're going to approve. And then lastly, we want to ensure that our doPost is checking which user is posting. We don't want to let just any user run the approval function. We might find we're under attack. So our approval flow that Eric showed us then becomes an author goes to a site, submits an article for publication. It gets written to our spreadsheet data store, and it gets emailed out to the approver. And then the approver in the email can just click a button to approve, and it will get posted back to the site for publication. So let's look at the first part of that, the request. This is almost identical to before. We send the body of the email out in the message, but we also include a little HTML form. And it's exactly as I mentioned before, a form action that's going to point back to our script server, a hidden value called row that's going to reference the spreadsheet row, and then a submit button that we're going to call approve in this case. And then we send it. So let's see that happening. I'm going to write yet another article, this time maybe Google I/O, an appropriate topic. And when we submit that, you'll see when we go to the email, it goes into the spreadsheet, And then when we go to the email, you'll see that we get the full article along with the approve button. All right. So now we just need to wire up the approve button. We have a simple do post, and now this time, instead of throwing up the content that was posted onto the screen for the approver, we're going to call Eric's very, very simple publish row and invoke that part of the workflow. And we're also going to let the user know, the approving user, know that it worked. So we click approve. And we have a very simple acknowledgement page that just says published. You could obviously make this as fancy as you like. But then when we go back to the site, we now have an article about Google I/O. All right. So this is all getting a little bit better. One thing, though, that I didn't talk about yet is the security of this. How do we know who clicked the approve button? And this is obviously critical. What happens if the approver accidentally forwarded the email to somebody else? Could they just click this button and would it work? Well, we showed you that the service itself is restricted to the domain or organization, but we really need a user-level check. So inside our do post function, this is a good example of what we could do. We could set the message to be access denied, and then only if the active user is the approving user would we actually call the publish function and update the message to be published. Otherwise, we just throw up whatever message we have on the screen for the approver, be it access denied or published. Now, obviously, we're not advocating hard-coding approvers into your script, but for clarity, this is the easiest way to show it. We'll talk a little bit later on about roles and how we can handle that more gracefully. So to get a little deeper into this security model, there's two user concepts inside AppScript when it's used as a service. There's the effective user, and that's the account running the script, the publisher in this case. And there's an active user, and that's the user whose fingers are at the keyboard. Script can only figure out who the active user is in special cases. Obviously, we don't want these public on the internet and publishers then scraping identities of all kinds of users who happen to visit a page. So it's only when both users are part of the same domain or organization we let you identify the user. And the domain must not be a special domain. We don't allow this in partner or EDU domains. So it's mostly Google Apps Premier, Google Apps Standard. So that was document approval. That was the entire workflow end to end. This next section of the talk is a little bit different. We're going to go into pretty advanced topics. I know this is a 101 level course. We're not going to go through detailed worked examples. We're going to talk more about theoretical ways that you can manage the complexity and add a few more, I won't say bells and whistles because that kind of implies they're unnecessary, but a few more little advanced tweaks to your workflow to make them more usable. The first thing, multiple approvers. The real value of a workflow is to codify a complex process. Our process was ridiculously simple. It's just one marketing person approving a post to a sites page. We generally need more than marketing. We probably need legal and PR and managerial approvals. And a big company, it's probably an awful lot of people involved. So how do we handle this explosion of complexity? And that's really what this section of the talk is about. So what we want to do is introduce a better representation for the state of the approval at any point in time. I'm going to use a simple diagram to illustrate this. The original workflow was a submit by anybody that would go to our marketing person who could then approve in the email or in the spreadsheet. But realistically, it would then go, once approved, to the PR person, and then maybe to legal, and then to the manager, and then get published, if we're lucky. And more often than not, something's going to go wrong and you're going to get rejected and go back to step one. To get even more realistic, it would get submitted to PR and marketing at the same time. And then only when it's approved by both at kind of a synchronization point, then it might go to legal, and then to the manager, and then to publish. And these are still probably very basic examples compared to what most of you deal with day to day. But even at this level, we're not going to include rejection because it's just getting too difficult to draw. So let's model this inside our process. This process is a sequence of steps. There's always one approver per step, and in the first step, there are actually multiple approvers. The approval state is going to be maintained inside the step. And I'm using step with a capital S here because it's an object type that we'll talk about in a moment. We're going to use a JavaScript object to represent that step. And then our process is simply an array of steps. Now, I've given you a sequential process. There's definitely more advanced things we can do, maybe in a 201 level course some other time. So just think about it that way. It's sequential, and so it's an array. So we're going to create a step. It's going to take a list of approvers for the step. We're going to create a JavaScript object in the first row. We're going to set the number of approvers in the step to be the number of elements passed in our array. We're going to copy that array. It's just a little quirk of JavaScript that we don't want to reference to an array. We want an actual copy, so we use the shorthand approvers slice. And then we're going to set the status for the overall step to be pending. Okay? Then we're going to iterate through all the approvers that we've been given and put a field into this object for each approver, indicating that approver's specific status. So on the right-hand side, if you're familiar with JSON, you'll see that if I create step with Evin and Bob, then I get the object beneath. Status is set to pending, 2 approvers. The approvers are Evin and Bob, and then both Evin and Bob have their status set to pending. All right, so pretty straightforward. Then we're going to create the process. We've got the little diagram of the example process in the top right. It's going to be an array, as we mentioned. So the first step in the array is marketing and PR. So we just simply push back that newly created step onto the array. The second step is legal. The third step is the manager. And then we return the process object. So it's just a slightly more complex JSON object. So now we've got a state representation for each step and for the entire process, and we want to be able to load and save that at will. So saving the process, I'm going to show you saving that to a spreadsheet because it's very easy to see, but as Eric said, you could use, ideally, some kind of SQL database. So I'm going to have a function that can save my process to a particular row inside a sheet. So I pull back a status cell to put this into, and then I set the value of that cell to the JSON stringify of the process. Now, if you're not really familiar with JavaScript, this isn't that much magic at all. It just serializes that JavaScript process into something that's actually human readable. We'll see that in a moment. To load, I just want to do the exact reverse. Given a sheet and a row, I want to pull back that cell and then turn it back into a real live JavaScript array and sub-objects, and all I do is call eval on the text I get back. So let's see that working. It's far easier when you see it than when I try and explain it. So we're going to run our example, and you'll see that it's very, very straightforward. We now have an array of steps that's been saved to the status row. And as we update that, we can load it and save it trivially. Okay, so now we've got a handle on how to manage the state. The algorithm breaks down to be something very, very straightforward. When we get something submitted into our workflow, we create an appropriate approval process. Okay? We write it back to our data store, and then we start the first step. And we do that by, in our case, emailing the approvers. You can just grab the first step, iterate through the approvers, and send each of them an email. Then when we get an approval event, because somebody has clicked the approval button or approved in some other manner, our script is going to wake up. It's going to go back and get the active step from our data store and update the status. So somebody just approved. I need to update the status. If the step now is fully approved, I'm going to start the next step, naturally send out more emails. And if all the steps are approved, I'm going to go to the final state, and in our case, that's publish. And this is pretty generic. You can use this for almost any level of complexity for a sequential workflow. So let's talk about dynamic approvals. Our process structure is very flexible. Steps can be added and removed trivially. We're just manipulating a JavaScript array, and I think everybody knows how to do that. So some of the things we could do is we could automatically add a legal step, perhaps, if a post contained profanity or restricted keywords or any kind of odd content that we were able to detect inside our script. Another thing we could do is, along with an approval button, we could also have a bunch of reference buttons or refer buttons. So if one of the approvers is concerned about the content, they could add a step by clicking not the approve button, but the refer to legal button, for example. So it really is quite a flexible system. So from here, let's look at another kind of advanced feature, reminders. As Eric pointed out when we were writing things to the data store, we can't just rely on emails. Emails often get overlooked and ignored. So the delays that cause are annoying and potentially costly. We're going to show a way to issue a daily reminder of pending approvals. And this is basically a nag email. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out who needs to be reminded. So we're going to get the pending approvers from our process. The pending approvers are going to be the approvers on the active step. So we're not really concerned about spamming everybody who's in the process, just those people who are pending. The first thing we do is we get the active step, and I'll show you that code in a moment. And then we're going to set up an array of pending approvers. So we don't want to spam the people who have already approved. We just want those in the step who are set to pending. So for every user in the list of approvers in the active step, we're going to check their status. So active step for user X is pending, then we push that user back onto the pending approvers. Let's have a look at the getActiveStep function. We're going to just iterate through the array of steps in the process, and we're going to find the first step that hasn't been fully approved, so the first step that's pending. Okay. So relatively straightforward, relatively simple. Then to send the reminders, our function is going to grab open our data store, our spreadsheet. It's going to pull all the data from the spreadsheet, and then it's going to iterate through every single row and get the pending approvers on each row and send them a reminder email. Okay? So in one step, we're going to iterate through the entire data store for every article that's pending and send reminders to everybody. And then we need a way to run this automatically. This is pretty important. Inside the spreadsheet editor, inside the script editor, you can set a function, in this case send reminders, to run automatically every day at a particular time. And so we're going to do it every morning between 8 and 9 a.m. So now when folks get into work, they'll have a bright, shiny email nagging them about approving whatever's on their plate. Okay, so that's a very basic reminder strategy. I think before you know it, you'd be getting nasty emails telling you to back off, that it's only been 24 hours, et cetera, But it's very easy to extend and customize. You could, for example, store the last date of nagging in the step, and then check how long it's been since you sent a nag, so that you're only sending a nag every few days. It really is a very solid foundation for escalations. If you're going to escalate something, though, you really need to know about the organizational hierarchy, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And this is one of the most important pieces of workflow, and I think it's something that traditionally we haven't had a great solution for. You typically do need to know a user's manager. You need to know who fills the PR role, who fills the marketing role, who fills the legal role. We need to be able to find the users responsible for the approval. And we don't want to hard code these things into a script that has to be updated every time there's an org change. We'd go crazy. So it is very important that a script be able to get access to an organization hierarchy. So at Google, we've got these things called Google profiles. And I guess, has everybody here seen their own Google profile? No, blank stares. Okay, one or two people. It really isn't all that useful in an enterprise setting. You go there and you see some security settings, you see your dashboard, you see your own email address, all things that you already know about, and generally not all that helpful. But behind that, there is an incredible data store that has a huge amount of information. And that's all thanks to a thing called Google Apps Directory Sync. Directory Sync allows you to take an LDAP server's content and synchronize it out to Google profiles, or maybe even an Active Directory server. This Apps Directory Sync runs inside your organization, periodically scraping all that data and pushing it out into the cloud, so then anything that's running outside your firewall and in the cloud still has access to all that information that's centrally managed inside your organization by LDAP or Active Directory or whatever system you're using. And you can see in the screenshot that there's all kinds of attributes like manager, assistant, division. So it's a wealth of information, and it's exactly what we need for workflow. Along with the directory sync and the profiles, there's a directory service that's going to be announced. Well, I guess I'm announcing it now. It's going to be released in the next couple of weeks. So we can use this to look up managers. So how do we call these APIs from AppScript? So AppScript has a beautiful range of very easy-to-use APIs, but obviously there's a lot more APIs that are available that aren't yet available in AppScript. So we're going to walk through an example of how to call these APIs from script. So I've thrown a big monster chunk of code on screen here, and I think you'll all be relieved to know that most of it is boilerplate. And also, I should highlight that in this case, we're going to call the Profiles API, and we're going to access the data store directly. The Profiles API has a weird characteristic in that it's admin access only. And the API that we're releasing in a couple of weeks is called the Directory Service, and that's available to everybody. And the main difference is that the Profiles API is read-write, and the Directory Service API is read-only. Our example is read-only, and so you'll be able to use this code pretty much exactly to call the directory service when it's released in a few weeks, and you won't need to be a domain administrator. All right, so the first part of the code here, what it does is, as I said, boilerplate. You tell it which service you're accessing, and then the documentation for that service gives you the access token URL, the request token URL, and the authorization URL. You then also set a consumer key and a consumer secret. And for every Google service, they're anonymous. Okay? It confuses everybody. Why would your key and secret be anonymous? But they are. And then we can set options. In this case, we're just going to give it a name, directory. We're going to say to use this OAuth token. That's actually what we're creating in the boilerplate code. We're creating an OAuth token. And then we're going to set the headers to tell it which version of GData to use. And really, the only important code here is at the very bottom of the screen, where we construct a URL to hit this service. And again, it's a URL from the documentation. And then on the very second last line, we're going to add the username that we're looking up and the options, and then we're going to return the content text. Okay, it's a mouthful, but trust me, it works. Actually, and this is just a larger version of what I was talking about. We're going to fetch at that URL. The username we took in as a parameter is just going to be appended at the end, and then we're going to return the result. So when I call that function on myself inside Google, this is actually what I get back. And I know it's very small for you to read. That's intentional. There's nothing all that interesting about what my entry is. But there's all kinds of stuff in there, like my telephone numbers, my email address, my manager's email address, my manager's name, the projects that I work on, the OUs that I'm a part of. Okay? So this is kind of a gold mine when it comes to process and workflow. So we now have a single source of truth for our org structure. It's available today in the Profiles API if you're a domain administrator. And if you're not, it'll be available to you in the Directory API in the next few weeks. So that's pretty much what we have for you today. I'm going to do a quick recap of what both Eric and I have talked about, and then we'll take some questions. We started with script in Sites. Sites is the hub for workflow, we believe. Actions on a site, embedding scripts into a site's page. Then Eric told you all about simple workflow, private comments to a site owner, very straightforward. And then we went into document approval, the simple publishing workflow with a single approver. And then we talked about approval mechanisms, how we can actually capture that approval action and translate it into motion. We talked about approving from a spreadsheet and approving from an email using HTML forms. Then we talked about multi-step approvals, and this is really where our workflow gets realistic. Saving the state of the approval is the key thing. It helps you manage the complexity if you have a good representation of the state, and I can't emphasize that enough. It may be a dry topic, but it'll save you weeks and weeks of frustration in the future if you do it nicely. We talked about dynamically altering the process, which is often essential. And then we talked about the additional features that are going to be essential, reminders, escalation, and figuring out how to navigate your org's hierarchy from script and from the cloud. All right, so that's what we have today. Maybe we'll hold it there for questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's more something I thought about when you were talking about the reminders, and you can set those scripts to run as a service.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there's turnaround in companies, and maybe the person who wrote that service is gone, and somebody's getting this constant reminder, and we don't know where it's coming from. Is there a way to see what services are running or that are still running out there in the cloud?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the question is, with all these different services that you may be running and all these different triggers that you may have set up, is there any central place to see what you've got?
Right.
For triggers, the answer is yes. Inside the script editor, when you go to the triggers menu, you can look at the triggers for the current script, or you can look at all your triggers.
Okay.
And so you can get a central view of everything that you've set up to run in response to an event.
So at an administrative level, we can see it across maybe all the scripts that other people have created within the organization?
No, it's on a per user basis.
Per user basis.
So it's intended to be user granularity. Absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, so you mentioned saving the state to a database, and so I know that hosted SQLs and trusted tester, are you going to be able to write from AppScript to hosted SQL?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the most exciting things that we'll be able to do shortly. For any folks who are on the hosted SQL trusted tester, feel free to come by, and I think I can hook you up with something that'll do that for you.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess that's all the questions. Thank you very much, everybody.